Hi, everyone, and welcome back to a Criminally Basic podcast. I'm Megan,
And I'm Hannah.
and today I decided to cover a solved case.
We're doing a solved case for once?
We're doing a solved case. I thought, between the disappearance of Lee Ochi and the roller coaster that was Casey Anthony, I really wanted to cover a case that had at least some kind of definitive end. That is when I stumbled across Pam Hupp and the several murders that she has been accused of, one of which she has been convicted of. Our story begins with a rather tragic diagnosis of breast cancer.
Oh,
I know. Elizabeth Faria, also known as Betsy, had been diagnosed with cancer in 2010 and in 2011 learned that it would be terminal. Betsy was married to a man named Russ Faria, and she had two children from a previous marriage. I couldn't find too much about their relationship prior to the really tragic events that were going to take place, but from all the research I did, it seemed that most people had a pretty neutral view of Russ. They had their issues occasionally, their marriage had its ups and downs, but all in all, it seemed rather, I guess, normal would be the right
yeah.
word. Betsy worked at State Farm with the subject of today's episode, Pam Hupp. There, they would become friends, according to an article from the St. Louis Magazine by Jeanette Cooperman. While they didn't appear to be super close at first, Pam began spending more and more time with Betsy. She would even go so far as to drive her to the vast majority of her chemo treatments. This sounds like the actions of, a trusted and supportive friend, one that you would like to have by your side if you went through something as awful as a terminal cancer diagnosis. Betsy even trusted Pam so much that she made a change to her life insurance policy.
Wait, what?
So, according to a Daily Film article, Betsy removed her husband as the beneficiary of her $150,000 life insurance policy and replaced him with Pam.
That's a little suspicious.
A little suspicious. I think anybody who is familiar with true crime, you might have some red flags going up now.
Yeah, just a few.
The reason for this was supposed to be so that Pam could put the money away in a trust fund for her kids. Betsy's kids weren't old enough yet to really know how to spend that money wisely, and she didn't entirely trust her husband not to spend it frivolously either. Betsy cared very, very deeply for her kids and wanted to make sure that she left behind something that could help them in their futures.
I feel like there would be a way so her kids could get it instead of having to put Pam.
I think perhaps what it was is that she didn't want her husband to have access at all to that money.
Yeah, and that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the date of her death would come sooner than expected. On Tuesday, December 27th, 2011, one of Betsy's friends came and drove her to chemo instead of Pam. This friend wanted to, spend some one-on-one time with her, catch up, just kind of be there for her. Even though Pam knew that someone else was going to drive Betsy to and from chemo, Pam would end up showing up rather unexpectedly to the treatment center anyway, much to the surprise of Betsy and her friend.
That's very odd.
Pam would actually end up driving Betsy home that day instead of her friend, and Pam would subsequently be the last person to see Betsy alive. Russ, Betsy's husband, was busy for the majority of that fateful Tuesday. According to the same article by Jeanette Cooperman, he was planning on picking Betsy up from her mother's house where she was supposed to go after chemo. So that other friend was supposed to take her to her mother's house instead of her own home, and then Russ would pick her up from there and drive her to their house.
Yeah.
But she would end up texting him saying that Pam was just going to drive her home instead. Now, the timestamps for the following events are important, so try to keep them in mind.
Okay.
Russ worked from home until 5 o'clock p.m., after which he called his wife, got gas, and then called his mother all by 5:22. At 5:56, he can be seen on security footage buying 2 bottles of Snapple at a convenience store and then leaving to make it to his friend's house around 6 o'clock. There, he and 4 of his friends would watch movies, they smoked, and just hung out until about 9 o'clock. After that, he left, swung through Arby's, and then made the 24.6-mile drive back home.
That's kind of a far drive.
It was kind of a far drive. I think it would take between 25 to 35 minutes, depending
Yeah.
on traffic.
Mhm.
So keep that in mind. 25 to 35 minutes to get home.
Okay.
Left around 9.
Okay.
At 9:40, Russ called 911 and reported that he had found his wife dead on the floor with blood pooled around her body.
Oh, that's not dying from cancer. That's something else.
That is something else entirely. In this 911 call, Russ remains relatively calm for someone who just walked into this horrifying scene. He says that he thinks Betsy killed herself due to the visible slashes on her wrist. And I would actually end up seeing in an interview later that she had threatened to kill herself before. She had written suicide notes previously. So he's walking in, finding his wife dead, and seeing slashes on her wrist. That's where his mind first goes. However, those visible slashes on her wrists were not her only injuries. It would later be revealed that Betsy had been stabbed 55 times.
55?
55 times. So when you hear of someone being stabbed that much, most people automatically assume that the perpetrator is someone who's close to the victim, like a crime of
Yeah.
passion type deal.
Yeah.
55 stab wounds is really excessive. It's far more than necessary to kill someone. 55, little much. There was a lot of blood around the body, but surprisingly, no bloody footprints,
Oh.
which, considering 55 stab wounds and the blood that results from that, you would expect for there to be something, right?
Yeah.
Considering the wounds that she had, and it wasn't just in one spot, it was all over her body, there was no way that it was self inflicted.
Yeah. So okay, it wasn't just centralized in one place. It was all over.
It was all over, and they weren't just superficial wounds either, like they were deep wounds.
Ooh.
Hmm. There was evidence that someone had been moving around the house. There was blood that was found on a light switch and on the walls, but the only other sign of blood was on Russ's own slippers, which were thrown on top of a pile of clothing in the closet.
Odd, but okay.
Right. If you're trying to cover up a murder, I wouldn't think that you would overlook something as obvious as bloody slippers.
Yeah.
Police automatically start with Russ as their main suspect, as, I think most of us would,
Yeah.
and they would interrogate him for 10 hours following the discovery of Betsy's body. They would even outright accuse him of the murder, especially after he failed a polygraph. However, his story never wavered. And
Yeah.
with, multiple witnesses, security footage placing him away from the scene of the crime, his defense team would later say that they thought that there was no way he could be convicted of this crime, and yet he was.
What?
So Pam steps back into the picture here. She was an important part of sending Russ to prison. She said that Betsy had been wanting to move closer to her family in St. Louis, which she knew that Russ wouldn't want. And she said that he had a violent temper, one that Betsy was afraid of. That, along with the change in beneficiary from the life insurance policy, was enough in the eyes of the police to charge him with murder. Because somehow,
An ironclad alibi means nothing.
exactly, Joel Schwartz, who was Russ's defense attorney, was, I think, like you and I are, baffled as to why they hadn't looked at Pam in the first place. She was the last person to see Betsy alive, and there were multiple eyewitnesses that accounted for every second of Russ's day. He stated that in between the time that Russ was assumed to have made it home and when he made his 911 call, remember he made the 911 call at 9:40,
Yeah.
he would have had less than 10 minutes from the time he leaves his friend's house to the time the 911 call took place. He would have had less than 10 minutes to kill his wife, clean up, and make that call.
So okay. I'm no murdering expert here. I don't think it's physically possible to stab someone 55 times in under 10 minutes.
No, and I don't know if like the crime scene investigators were able to determine a time of death with that, but I mean, there's, in my
Right.
mind, no way. The legitimacy of Russ's polygraph was also called into question. So he had been up for almost 24 hours and had smoked marijuana that evening, which pretty much any polygraph giver, I don't know what the term for that is, but anybody who's administering a polygraph would have to take that into account. You know, he's been up for a really long time. He has not been sober. That
Found
would
her
all
murdered in a pool of blood.
right. That would all impact his polygraph because, as we know, polygraphs measure stress.
Yeah, and I would think you would be under a lot of stress if you've been up for 24 hours and your wife's just been murdered and you saw it.
Exactly, and you're being accused of that murder.
Yeah.
So it is not illegal to polygraph someone under these circumstances, apparently, but those circumstances have to be disclosed when presenting the results. You know, you have to say this person was up for a really long time, they were not sober or like were high at some point earlier in that evening, and no disclosure of any kind was given.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that would just throw out the validity of it altogether.
One would think, but nonetheless, Russ was convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
Oh my God.
Also, Pam would never make that trust fund for Betsy's kids, like she promised she would.
Oh, of course. She spent it, didn't she?
I don't know what she did with the money, but I mean, it was her money as the beneficiary of her life insurance policy. And I don't believe there was any agreement in writing as to what she would do with it. So that $150,000 was just hers.
To anyone that listens to this, make sure you get everything in writing. I don't care what it is, get it in writing.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. The next death to follow Pam was that of her mother, Shirley Noonan. At 78 years old in 2013, Shirley was living in a senior housing community with both arthritis and dementia. On October 30th, her daughter Pam dropped her off at her apartment and told the staff there not to expect her for dinner or breakfast. Why? I'm not sure, but told the staff, don't worry about her.
Okay.
The next morning, the staff at the housing unit would find Shirley dead outside, seemingly having fallen off her third-story balcony after the aluminum rails had broken.
Oh my God.
She was found to have 8 times the normal dose of Ambien in her system. Even though the likelihood of the rails breaking was incredibly low, Shirley's death was considered just a tragic accident, and Pam would receive over $100,000 from different investments that Shirley had made and her life insurance policy.
Girl is racking up on the life insurance policies.
It's very suspicious, and I mean, unfortunately, there was nothing that could really be done about it. The death was originally deemed as like accidental, but it would later be classified as, I think, undetermined. But I mean, unfortunately, there was no way of really knowing exactly what happened. Although I think we can kind of all assume what happened. The final death was that of 33-year-old Louis Gumpenberger, who was a homeless man struggling with both physical and mental issues. This would end up being Pam's downfall, though. And honestly, what I kind of consider a rather, I don't want to say funny 911 call. So have you ever been to like a high school play and like there's a kid who's delivering a monologue with just no passion, just monotone?
Oh, okay. This is going to be mean, but I saw some people in my acting class do that.
Same. Quick disclosure here before I play this 911 call. Also, apologies for the audio. I realized that I didn't record this while Hannah and I were recording together. I will be cutting up this audio a little bit from the 911 call. The version that I could find is a little under 2 minutes. It cuts off right before you hear any gunshots or anything really disturbing. I don't think we need to hear that, but I will be only playing the most important parts of this call.
911, what's your emergency? Hey, hello, there's someone broken in my house. Help! What's the address you're at? Help! Woman, you will make it your wife? I'm getting in the car with you. No, get away. Get out, get out, get out. Help!
I know that we say all the time that you never know how you're going to react in a life or death situation. Some people are completely calm, some people are freaking out and unable to do anything. So like Russ's 911 call, for instance, he was really calm because that was just how he naturally reacted. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was, his wife is dead. He needs to call 911. He's doing what he has to do. But I would like to think that if you are being chased with a knife through your home, that you would have a little bit more of a reaction than help, help. Some of the worst acting I think we have seen.
I know 5-year-olds that could act better than that.
Seriously. So, fortunately, this 911 call would end up being Pam's downfall. But unfortunately, Louis Gumpenberger would die after being shot 5 times in her home. Police would end up finding a note on his body that had the instructions, quote, kidnap Hupp, get Russ's money from Hupp at her bank, and kill Hupp. Take Hupp back to house and get rid of her. Make it look like Russ's wife. Make sure knife sticking out of neck, end quote. The note also stated that if he did this, that he would receive a reward of $10,000. So basically trying to make it look like Russ is exacting some sort of revenge on her. Immediately after this incident, police arrive, find him dead, find this note. Pam would voluntarily go to police headquarters and claim that Louis, who was armed with a knife, had jumped out of a car that was passing by her home, driven by another person, walk up her driveway, threaten her while she sat in her car, and demanded that she drive them to a bank to get money for Russ, to get Russ's money. Pam said that she knocked the knife out of his hands, ran into her house, and Louis followed her into her home, after which she shot him in self-defense with a gun that she kept in her nightstand.
Okay.
This was entirely out of character for Louis. The people who knew him said that he was quiet, soft-spoken. He had been in a car accident earlier in his life, which led to his physical and mental disabilities, and that he wasn't really, I guess, capable of super complex thoughts. So this was something that he would never do to begin with, just with his physical and mental capabilities, was so far out of the realm of possibility that it just...
Yeah, way too out of character for him.
So police did find a knife on Louis's body, but they would later find that the knife and a few other items that were found on his body were most likely purchased at a Dollar Tree nearby and purchased by Pam. After the police see all of this, hear the 911 call and kind of the strange circumstances surrounding this whole thing, it just didn't sit right with them. And eventually, on August 23rd of 2016, Pam was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Louis Gumpenberger.
Good.
So she's arrested and she asks to visit the restroom, where she then proceeds to take a ballpoint pen and stab herself in a suicide attempt. Fortunately, she survived. We don't want this murderer getting away from the justice.
No, you need to rot in prison.
She is. She is rotting in prison right now. She originally would plead not guilty to the crime of murder, but she then changed it to a guilty plea in 2019 once she found out that the death penalty was on the table for this case. She has not been charged with the murder of Betsy or of her mother, but police are looking into it. And I think really the only positive outcome of this is that Russ was acquitted of the murder of his wife.
Oh, good.
He ended up only serving 2 years of what would have been a life sentence. And even though those are 2 years that he's never going to get back, his innocence has at least been proven.
Yeah, good.
But at the end of the day, the person who most likely killed Betsy, it's not proven, so we can't say that it was definitely her, but the woman who I feel comfortable saying most likely killed Betsy is in prison right now and will never get out and will never cause harm to another human ever again. Thank you all for listening to A Criminally Basic Podcast. If you'd like to learn more, check us out at A Criminally Basic Podcast on Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.
And check out our sources as well as photos on our website, www.criminallybasicpodcast.podbean.com.
Thank you for listening.